For the next two modules, we're going to now turn to the psychology of religion at two different levels. Here in Module 2, we're going to talk about what's called the cognitive science of religion, which seeks to understand how is it that people come to think about gods and other religious beliefs. Is this something that comes naturally to us? What is it about the structure of the human mind that makes it such a comfortable home for those religious beliefs? And are there aspects of the mind that constrain what types of religious beliefs we have? Then in Module 3, we'll turn to the social psychology of religion. There we'll try to understand what are the functions that religious beliefs and symbols and teachings and rituals serve for both individuals and for groups. Do religions make people more ethical? How do religions bind groups together? And how do religions divide groups, leading to prejudice against outgroup members and against atheists? In this lecture, we'll tackle the question of the naturalness of religious belief, and specifically of theistic beliefs. Are supernatural God beliefs things that come innately and inevitably to the human mind? In a recent article, developmental psychologists Kanika Banerjee and Paul Bloom put this question differently. They asked, would Tarzan believe in God? The crux of that question is whether a human being, removed from all social learning, would actually still come to hold these supernatural God beliefs. To learn more about this so-called born believer hypothesis, let's talk to another developmental psychologist. Here's Christine Laguerre from UT Austin.
I think the human mind, it's no accident that religion comes from the human mind. There's a lot about religion that is deeply psychologically natural. So I think it's a byproduct of different features of our psychology that have been selected for other purposes. So for example, thinking about agency, pattern detection, fear of punishment, thoughts about a just world, all these sorts of things make sense in the context of a social group living species. The larger the groups, the bigger problems of cooperation. And religion basically parasitizes many different features of our evolved, basically social group psychology. I mean, it's an empirical question ultimately. Clearly, religion is the product of cultural evolution and is based on our intuitive psychological principles that were likely evolved, were selected for other purposes. The evidence that we have thus far most supports that particular account.
So would Tarzan believe in God?
Yeah, I think Tarzan would be very superstitious.
Okay.
I think he would be prone to make the same sorts of inferences about different outcomes in the world. He wouldn't believe in an Islamic God,
of course,
or a Jewish God. But would he have some intuitions about hard to explain paranormal outcomes? Sure.
Okay.
I think that's entirely plausible.
In the next few lectures, we're going to talk about certain features of the human mind that draw it towards religion and in some ways constrain the types of religious beliefs that emerge. For instance, we'll talk about something called the hyperactive agency detection device, which is a feature of the human mind that evolved to allow us to better detect predators and prey out in the world, but as a consequence has led us to overperceive agency where there is none. We'll also talk about the tendency to overperceive purpose and goal states out in the world, something which turns us all into little intuitive creationists. And we'll talk about the existential fears that underlie the human condition, that draw us towards the soft, comforting bosom of religion. But right now, I want to talk more about mind-body dualism. So humans are fundamentally social creatures. That's one of the features that has led us to so completely diverge from the other animals that we share the planet with. In just the last few million years, our brains have undergone a massive amount of evolutionary change to enable us to better navigate an increasingly complex social world. As a result, we have many mental adaptations to allow us to better understand other people's minds, to be able to predict their behavior, to understand their goal states. And these abilities together are what psychologists call theory of mind. The developmental psychologist Paul Bloom, who we talked about a little earlier, has argued that our system for understanding mental states is fundamentally separate from the system we use to understand physical objects. And for evidence, he points to some research from his own lab with babies, where he shows that babies react very differently when physical objects violate the laws of physics compared to when people do. So it turns out that babies are born with an innate sense of what's called folk physics, so a basic inbuilt understanding of the laws of physics. And so when they see a ball disappear from one location and appear in another, they get surprised. But when they see a social object do the same thing, like a human being do the same thing, they don't get surprised. Now the reason that's significant is because they have to learn that social objects, like human beings, follow the same types of rules as physical objects. In other words, they have to learn that social objects are physical objects. Bloom also points to the selective impairments suffered by those on the autism spectrum disorder, who see deficits in the social system, but no impairments in the physical system. And in fact, those who are furthest along the autism spectrum tend to see human beings pretty much only as physical objects. But most of us don't. So most of us have difficulty seeing psychological properties in terms of a physical system. And this is where mind-body dualism comes in. So our two separate systems make our mind and body seem like they're separate entities, with minds not made up of the same physical bodily stuff, but instead as entities which inhabit the body. Sort of like a driver inhabits a car or software inhabits a computer. And that's why it's so easy for us to imagine minds getting switched interchangeably between bodies, like when Charles Xavier transferred his psyche from his own dying body to the body of an unconscious comatose patient in the terrible X-Men 3.
Just terrible.
It's also why we're able and even likely to think of our mental lives, including our thoughts and our feelings and our personalities, existing without our bodies, floating freely in the ether. Now, anybody who knows how the mind works knows that it doesn't work like that. Our thoughts and our feelings and our personality are the product of the physical aspects of our brain, of the neurons and the connections between them. And so if you're going to want to transfer somebody's mental life between bodies, you're going to have to bring their entire brain with them. But that's not what's intuitive to people. So the developmental psychologist Jesse Bering showed this in an elegant study he did with David Bjorklund in 2004. What they did is they gave children a story about an alligator that ate a mouse, and then they asked the children various questions about the mouse. They asked about the mouse's biological, that is physical life. So does the mouse now still have to go to the bathroom? Does his brain still work now that his life is ended? And also about the mouse's psychological life. So does the mouse still love his brother? Does the mouse miss his mother? Now the kids were clear that the biological functions would cease now that the mouse is dead. But half of them believed that the psychological functions would still continue. Now in older children and in adults, this mental life gets further abstracted into this cultural idea of a soul, which is similarly immaterial and similarly contains people's psychological essence. But it's still consistent with this idea that, in the words of Justin Bering, psychological immortality is a cognitive default. In other words, the belief that elements of our psychological experience will persist after our body's demise is more or less natural. So even Tarzan would believe it. Now, in contrast, our best scientific understanding of death, that all our mental activity ceases when our brain activity ceases, is not the default way of thinking. It's not intuitive. You can even do this exercise right now. So take a few seconds, close your eyes, and try to contemplate what it would be like to no longer exist. It's impossible, right? Maybe you did what I did, which is you had this visual external perspective of your grave. Or maybe you're really good at this and just managed to visualize the color black. In the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre's The Wall, he has this great passage where you have these two prisoners who are waiting their own execution and they're talking in their jail cell. And one says to the other, "I'm a materialist. I swear it to you. I'm not going crazy, but something's the matter. I see my corpse. That's not hard, but I'm the one who sees it with my eyes. I've got to think that I won't see anything anymore, and that the world will go on for the others. We aren't made to think like that." And he's right. We aren't meant to think like that. So when we try to imagine a future experience or somebody else's experience, the way we do this is to run an approximation on ourselves, a simulation of their experience with our own mental lives. So imagine our ancestors living in the African savannah 40,000 years ago. In the absence of an abstract and scientific understanding of what happens when we die, how are they to make sense of what's happening to Grandpa when his body stops moving on the floor of the cave? Well, we relied on our best intuitions. So he must still be having some form of mental life, just not the type of mental life that's immediately tied to the body. So being good dualists, we conclude that his bodily life may have ended, but his mental life, his psychological life, still goes on in some form of post-life state, some sort of afterlife. This example of intuitive dualism illustrates how the structure of the human mind makes it so receptive to the ideas that seem to be recurrent across religions. So ideas of immaterial souls and of afterlives. It also explains why the abstraction of more scientifically supported positions, say of psychological death occurring with brain death, can be difficult to grasp. They run counter to the direction that our minds are nudging our beliefs. Now, in the next lecture, we'll talk about how our minds also nudge us towards seeing gods and purpose out in the world. How they make us not just intuitive dualists, but intuitive creationists and intuitive theists as well.